In this video, we will be graphing the sine function. I will be reviewing amplitude and center line from your previous videos, as well as introducing period. So amplitude is the number in front of the sine function. Amplitude itself is always positive. A does not have to be positive though. It can be positive or negative. If A is positive, then my function will start at the center line, go up to the max, go back to the center line, back to the min, and then back to the center line. If A is negative, it also starts at the center line, but then it goes to the minimum, the center line, the maximum, and the center line. So if A is positive or negative, it gives me direction, whereas amplitude is always positive. This is the same pattern for all of sine curves. The number added or subtracted after the sine function is known as either our center line or our midwave. This must be written as an equation y equals d because we're talking about a horizontal line. Now we use the center line and the amplitude to find the max and min for our y values. The maximum y value is going to be our center line plus our amplitude. The minimum y value is always going to be our center line minus my amplitude. This will help me figure out how to label my y-axis. Example 1, y equals sine of x plus 3. Even though it's not written, there's technically a 1 in front of sine of x and then plus 3. So therefore my amplitude is a positive 1. My center line is y equals 3. My maximum is going to be my center line plus my amplitude, so I have a maximum y value of 4. The minimum is going to be 3 minus my amplitude, so I have a minimum value of 2. Now we can use this information to set up our xy axis. Our x-axis, we haven't done anything yet, so we're just going to use our normal points from our unit circle, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. The y-axis I must label up to my maximum of 4 down to my minimum of 2. And then we're going to draw in a dotted line at the center line y equals 3. Once you have the xy axis set up, we're ready to graph. Since A is positive, we're going to start at my center line, then go up to the maximum, come back to the center line, minimum, and then go back to the center line, and then fill in the chart with those respective y values. Now let's look at a second example. Y equals negative 2 sine of x plus 4. The A is negative 2, which means my amplitude is 2. My center line is y equals 4. My maximum is 6, and my minimum is 2. So I'm going to use that information to set up my xy axis. Again, I haven't done anything to the x-axis. And then when we label our y-axis, make sure you go all the way up to 6. And we're going to draw in a dotted line at the center line y equals 4. Once you have the xy axis, then we are ready to graph the sine function. So since it's negative, it's still going to start at the center line, but then the next value is going to go down to the minimum, then go back up to the center line, maximum, and then go back to the center line. And then again, fill in those respective y values into your chart. Now we are going to be changing the x-axis values. So when there's a number in front of the x inside the sine function, this is when I know I'm going to change the x-axis values. So in this case, we're going to call it b. B tells me how many cycles of the sine curve we can see during a length of 2 pi, which is what we've been doing now. Our b has always been 1, so we've always seen 1 full cycle in a length of 2 pi. But if our b is 2, then we can see 2 full cycles in 2 pi. One cycle consists of the 5 points that we've been graphing. That's what we've been doing in this video. you're only going to ever be required to graph one cycle of sine and cosine. So you're not going to have to graph more than 2 cycles of just sine and cosine. Now, since we only need to graph one cycle, we need to find out the length of one cycle so that we can stop our graph. So in order to do this, we're going to find something called the period. The period is found by doing 2 pi divided by whatever our b value is. So let's look at an example where our period is going to be different than 2 pi, which is going to change our x-axis. So example 3, we have y equals -2 sine of 4x. So our amplitude is 2. My center line is 0 because there's nothing added or subtracted after. My maximum is 2 and my minimum is -2. Now my period I'm going to find by doing 2 pi divided by 4. I want to reduce that to get pi over 2. Once I have a different period, I'm going to find something called the spacing. The spacing is always found by taking your period and dividing it by 4. So I'm going to take pi over 2 divided by 4. When I'm dividing fractions, that's the same thing as pi over 2 times 1/4. So I have a spacing of pi over 8. Now I'm going to use the spacing to find the 5x values. Now we're still going to start at x equals 0. Later on we're going to talk about when this will change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at x equals 0 and add my spacing. So I have 0 plus pi over 8. So my second x value is pi over 8. My third x value is I'm going to take that second x value and add my spacing again. So I get pi over 8 plus pi over 8. I get 2 pi over 8, and then we would always reduce that to give me pi over 4. My fourth x value, again, I take the third x value, 2 pi over 8, add my spacing. So my fourth x value is 3 pi over 8, which would make my fifth x value 4 pi over 8, and then we would have to reduce that to be pi over 2. Now, with all of this information, I'm ready to set up my xy axis. So my y-axis, make sure we label from our min to our max. So from -2 up to 2. And I didn't draw in the center line because the center line is just going to be at the x-axis, but we can sketch that in if you want. Now the x values are going to be the x values that I just found. So I'm starting at 0. The first x value was pi over 8. The second one was pi over 4. The third one was 3 pi over 8, and then the next one was pi over 2. Now that we have everything set up, we're ready to graph. So since it's a negative sine curve, it starts at my center line, goes down to my minimum, goes back up to the center line, then to my maximum, then to my center line. And again, fill in your chart with those respective y values. Example 4 will be our last example in this video. Y equals 5 sine of 1/4 x plus 3. So our amplitude is 5. My center line is 3. My maximum is then going to be 8, and my minimum is going to be -2. Since my b value is 1/4, I use that to find the period. So I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 1/4. So I get 2 pi times 4 over 1, which gives me 8 pi. I use the period to find my spacing, so I get 8 pi divided by 4, so that gives me a spacing of 2 pi. Again, our first x value is always going to start at 0 for now. Then I'm going to use that and add my spacing. So 0 plus 2 pi gives me 2 pi. 2 pi plus 2 pi gives me 4 pi. Add another 2 pi, I get 6 pi. Add another 2 pi, I get 8 pi. So I can use that information to set up the xy axis. Again, make sure your y-axis goes down to -2 and then goes all the way up to your maximum of 8. And draw in your center line at y equals 3. Now that you have everything set up, we're ready to graph my sine curve. It's a positive sine curve, so I start at the center line, go up to the maximum, go back to the center line, go to the minimum, and then go back to the center line. Again, fill in your chart with those respective y values. This is our last example for this video, and then we will look at more examples next time in class.